So we're going to go ahead and get started with risk assessment. And as you can see, the publication for risk assessment is 830, revision 1. And watch out for the revisions. So sometimes if you get somehow, especially if you Google and you don't go straight to CSRC, you know, make sure you go to CSRC and then you're going to see the most recent version. So just watch out that you're not using an old version. And I've had a couple people, 53 Rev 4 has been out since April, but actually in 53, Rev 3 is still posted out there. But I've gotten a couple people asking me questions about things, and I just could tell from being so intimately familiar with 53 that they were looking at 53 Rev 3 and not 53 Rev 4. So just watch out that you have the most current Rev. And so for 830, it is revision 1. And it is focused solely on conducting risk assessments. And so we see here that the evolution of risk and information security, we started out mostly just being concerned with confidentiality, and now we're concerned with all 3 of the security objectives, integrity and availability as well. We just wanted to protect information, but now we need to share information a lot, so we have to make adjustments for that, and so that we can share information. And that's why we need to make sure what our risk is so that we can communicate that to whoever we're sharing with. We used to have a static point in time focus. We would do an assessment and then that was it. You know, now we're focused more on ongoing and situational awareness, dynamic and continuous monitoring, right? So government-centric solutions versus commercial solutions. I was just talking about, you know, NIST used to try to develop tools, and we had developed, what was it called, an asset tool or something like that. I don't know. We had years and years and years ago with 826, if anyone remembers that. Does anyone remember that? No, only me. Okay. So, but anyway, we found that we didn't have the resources to do that, and so we moved towards working with industry to come up with commercial solutions. And then we used to just we're going to avoid that risk, and now we want to manage risk. Again, sometimes we accept risk, sometimes we mitigate risk, and so on. So that's kind of an evolution there. Here's the risk management framework. This is actually in 837, but I just wanted to show it and ask the group during which steps, here's the 6 steps of the risk management framework. During which of these steps do you think we conduct risk assessments? Anybody?
After the fact?
Should be throughout. Throughout, very good, in all of them. So you can definitely, and it's probably useful to conduct risk assessments, even if it's just a little mini risk assessment throughout in each step of the process. So we'll be getting into this a lot more when we do 37 later. So risk management and risk assessment. Risk assessment is, if you'll recall, the second step in the risk management process from 839. And if we can recall from like 30 minutes ago, framing, assessing, responding, and monitoring. So here we are, a whole pub just on the assessment part of that, the assessment step of risk management. And so again, if we can recall from like 30 minutes ago, risk framing, we start out by finding out what our assumptions are, what our constraints are, what our priorities and trade-offs, what's the risk tolerance of our organization, and we're applying that across all of our tiers. And then we get to risk assessment. I'm not sure why I redid all these slides, but anyway, sorry about that. Let's see, so in risk assessment, we identify our threat sources and threat events. We identify vulnerabilities, and then we determine the risk, what is the impact, what is the likelihood that that's going to occur. And we also talk about uncertainty with risk assessment. So where in our risk assessment were we making subjective decisions, and where were we uncertain about the decisions we made. And we note that down so that we have better understanding. And we talked about risk response, developing the risk response strategy. What are we going to do? Accept, reject, mitigate, or share, and what's our course of action going to be, and then risk monitoring, verifying compliance, what's the effectiveness of our measures, and looking at ongoing changes to our organization, and make sure that our bottom line is increasing situational awareness. So getting right into 830, revision 1, there's our chapters, and then it's got a bunch of appendices. And if you're coming to one of the workshops on Thursday or Friday, we're going to go through a whole sort of mocked up risk assessment or a fake risk assessment that you guys are going to kind of go through yourself, and these appendices figure prominently in that. So, as does the first part, but anyway, that's one of the things we're going to do in the workshop on Thursday, in the workshops on Thursday and Friday. So I hope to see all of you in one of those. So the risk assessment overview is, again, like I said, identify what are the threats to the organization, how is the organization vulnerable or is it vulnerable, and what's the impact if a vulnerability is exploited, and how likely is it that that is going to happen. So the goal of the risk assessment is a determination of risk. So again, what is the degree of potential harm, and again, how likely is it? So you're going to hear this over and over, and this is what we determine when we do a risk assessment. So some key terms: risk, measure the extent to which the entity is threatened. We already did that one earlier, I think. Risk assessment, the process of identifying, prioritizing, and estimating information security risks. Threats, we have a threat is any circumstance or event that could adversely impact an organization through the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. And then with that, we have threat sources. So where are the threats coming from? Is it external? Is it internal? Is it environmental? Is it a failure of resources? And then we have the threat event, something actually happens. The threat source actually does something and breaks in, or we actually have a hurricane or something like that. That's the threat event. The vulnerability is an inherent weakness in the system or in our processes surrounding the system that opens us up to be vulnerable for threats. And of course, the likelihood is pretty obvious, but it does include the likelihood of the threat event occurring, along with the likelihood that there will be an impact. So when we go through the risk assessment workshop, we'll see how that all works. It sounds a little confusing just saying it. And then of course the impact is the magnitude of harm that is going to take place as a result of the loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So just a quick review of terms there. So what are some types of threat sources? We probably, being security professionals, we already know this, but just to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music. We have purposeful attacks, or we call them in 30 adversarial versus non-adversarial. And so those are the purposeful attacks, and they can be perpetrated by individuals, either internal or external people, or groups, organizations, or even in some cases nation states are after us, and they are out to get our information. And I'm sure if any of us work with our intrusion detection systems, we see how much hammering is being done at our borders. So we also have other, accidental human errors. So it's not on purpose, but it can still be a threat, and we still have to address how we're going to protect against that. We have environmental disruptions, of course. We just had the terrible weather, tornadoes and whatnot in the Midwest yesterday. So we have to consider those, and then of course structural threats, equipment failures, those sorts of things can still cause us problems and cause us to certainly have a loss of availability at a minimum. So those are our threat sources. We also have to determine our risk models, and the risk model defines the terms we're going to use and the risk factors, and we see here the factors are simply what we already have said: threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts. So when we say risk factors, this is what we mean: threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts. And what are the relationships among those factors? So that's what we determine in our risk model. And here is a risk model figure, which has a lot of small writing on it, and when I tried to paste it in a PowerPoint, as you can see, there was some mess ups there. But if you look in 830, this is figure 2 from 830 revision 1, but this is a sample risk models figure where you can see that the threat source identifies a threat event and is exploited by a vulnerability, and then it causes an impact and so on. So basically what we've just talked about, this is it depicted. This is your threat model or your risk model. And this is actually for an adversarial threat. So in 30 Rev 1, we separate a lot of it into non-adversarial threats versus adversarial threats, because a lot of times you're going to take different types of actions and mitigation actions depending on what kind of threat it is. So we have some different approaches we can use when we do risk assessment, and we can do quantitative, qualitative, or semi-quantitative. And so quantitative assessment approach is when numbers are the actual numbers that they have meaning in any context. So 1 + 1 always equals 2, we hope. And so when we do a quantitative risk assessment, that means we have to have cold, hard numbers that we can add and subtract and do math with. And so if we don't have that, we really can't do an adequate quantitative assessment. And so, and that we found is that type of information across the board is really difficult to come by with information security. So 30 Rev 1 is focused on qualitative and semi-quantitative risk assessments. So we talk about the difference, and we talk about what a quantitative risk assessment is, but when we go through our process and the examples and in the appendices and things, we're focused on qualitative risk assessments there. And is there some subjective decisions made when doing a qualitative risk assessment? Sure, of course there is. But again, we hope that we don't just have a single person in a vacuum doing the risk assessment. We hope that you have a team of people with different stakeholders doing the risk assessment, so you get input from all the different stakeholders, and hopefully that helps you come out the other end with a risk assessment that is accurate and reasonable to the greatest extent possible. And then then we have semi-quantitative, which is really qualitative with just a more granular scale. So it's just, instead of saying low, moderate, or high with as we do with qualitative, we say, we give it a scale. So whatever, 0 to 10, or and 11 to 15, or whatever. You can do whatever you want as far as semi-quantitative, but those numbers aren't going to add up. So if you say a risk is 5 on a semi-qualitative scale over here, and a risk over here is 37, those don't add up to 42 from a math perspective. So it's just a way of making your designations more granular, so that it might help you prioritize your risks and have a better understanding of where you're sitting, or a more granular understanding. So that's all semi-quantitative is. And again, you can make those scales be whatever you want, whatever's going to work for you, however granular you need to have it. Is everybody with me? So those were our assessment approaches, and then we also have some various analysis approaches. So you can have a threat-oriented approach, where you start with the identification of all the threat sources and events. You can have an asset or impact-oriented, where you look at your high-level or your high-value assets. You can have vulnerability-oriented and look at your predisposing conditions and your vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the system. You can do it, so we usually start with a threat-oriented approach. Then you can combine other analysis types, and this gets into some pretty detailed information, again, all found in 830, but you can add graph-based analysis or a rigorous analysis methodology to improve the rigor and effectiveness of your risk assessment. And then, so information about that is in 830 Rev 1. And again, those two, like the graph-based or the rigorous types of methodologies, those are used in conjunction with the other, threat-oriented, asset and impact-oriented, or vulnerability-oriented. So it's not one or the other in that case. It's sort of the graph-based of the rigorous analysis is sort of piled on top to help you improve your rigor. And again, when would we want greater rigor in our risk assessment? That would be when? Anybody?
Especially after an event.
after an event, yep, or if we're just if our organization has a low level of risk tolerance, then we're gonna need more rigor in our assessment methodologies. But yes, if we have a nasty event take place, then we also might want to delve into it a little deeper. Here again, we see the triangle, and you'll see this repeated also again and again. So we're looking at risk assessment at every one of those levels. And so at Tier 1, what we look at is the risk assessment is supporting, again, organization-wide strategies. So the risk assessment there is not looking at systems, but if anything, it's looking at an aggregated risk of all the systems. But the focus is more on the organizational operations, assets, and individuals that are up at that organizational level, considering mission essential functions. And it is based on assessments. So you're going to use the information when you're doing a risk assessment at Tier 1. You're going to use risk assessment results from actually both Tiers 1 and Tiers 2. And then consider mission essential functions that you may have identified in your, do you guys do continuity of operations plans here? So in that you have to identify what your more impactful processes are. So you want to figure that information, or your functions, that's it, mission essential functions. You want to figure that in at the organizational level, and then of course whatever your results are, we want to have that. Here's our arrows. We want to have our back and forth communication there. And when the risk assessment, when you're finished at Tier 1, you may have some organizational mandates, coming down. They might decide everyone, now this is an organization-wide situation, so now everybody needs to do, whatever. So that is risk assessment at Tier 1. At Tier 2, we are there at the mission business process level, so we're looking at resiliency requirements, we're looking at the enterprise architecture, how we're going to allocate controls maybe to there, where the risk is stemming from, focusing again on those mission and business segments. Let's see here, informing decisions regarding the use of information systems to support those mission business functions, like I mentioned earlier. And then here we have our business continuity plans, and of course we would want the risk assessment at Tier 2 to be closely aligned with any business continuity plans, because we're at that mission business process level. And again, we have the communications back and forth, and then provide ongoing assessments. So then that's the monitoring. So that's Tier 2. And then of course at Tier 3, we're focused on our individual systems. We're looking at the system development life cycle. Depending on what phase of the life cycle we're in is going to depend on what we do with the risk assessment. So, and this is different than the steps in the risk management framework that we saw at the beginning. The system development life cycle is a different process. But again, in 37, we do tie them both together. So in any case, the initial risk assessment during development hopefully helps you come up with recommendations for how you're going to select your security controls in step 2 of the risk management framework. And then you have those initial results, and then as you move through the SDLC, you're going to update those results and also look for new problems. And then of course you record those results in your risk assessment reports. And again, as we said earlier, we're going to be looking at conducting risk assessments in all 6 of the risk management framework steps. Maybe you don't need to every time, it depends, but it certainly can be, and maybe in some cases should be. So at Tier 3, the step 1 of the risk management framework is to use initial risk assessment results to inform your impact analysis for categorization. So the first step of the risk management framework is categorization. What information am I processing on this system? What is the impact of it, both from the standpoint of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and the risk assessment's results might help you determine what those impacts are. And then that will help you, again, prepare for your security control selection, because now you know what my impacts are, what risks might be associated there, and so what controls can I use to mitigate that when we select. In step 2, so in the risk management framework, in the select step, again, you use those results to tailor your baseline. So we're going to talk a lot when we get to 53 about tailoring our baseline of controls, and your risk assessment results are really going to help you in that step. So you need that initial risk assessment to help you tailor that baseline and identify common controls with potential points of failure. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves with common controls. Does everybody already know what a common control is? Kind of, some of you. It's a control that's provided by another entity, not implemented at the system level. But in any case, so you want to look at those with respect to your system and determine and use your risk assessment to help you determine, is this common control that I can inherit and apply to my system, is that really going to work for me? Or is there a single point of failure there that I need to be concerned with? And you update your risk assessments to modify the initial control selection, or use updated risk assessment to modify the initial control selection. So again, you might have to go back, and if new threats emerge, then you may have to add new controls and go back to step 2 in the risk management framework and select some new controls to implement based on some new threats and vulnerability data that you might get. And so in step 3 of the risk management framework, which is the implement step, you can use the risk assessment to help you determine the most effective way to implement your controls. So we all know, especially if we looked at 53, but even if we haven't, there's a lot of different ways that you can implement controls that make a difference in how the control functions and its effectiveness. So you can use the risk assessment results to help you determine how you're going to do specific implementations. And it can also help you inform a cost-benefit analysis or any risk trade-offs. And then, use updated risk assessments to help determine if the current implementation is still effective, right? So is what I've done before, especially now you're in an ongoing situation, your system's been in operation, is what I did before still okay? Is my current implementation still good? So in that implement step, you can use the risk assessment to help you determine that. And then in step 4, the assessment step, so this is where we go in and we actually assess, are our controls working effectively, all the controls that we implemented during step 3. And so the risk assessment is going to be really important here to help you determine what type of assessment you might want to conduct, and we'll get into that a little later when we talk about 53A. How frequently you might want to do assessments. So that's something that comes with continuous monitoring as well, when we're not just doing a static every 3-year process. We're deciding how often we want to look at our controls and assess them for effectiveness, and your risk assessment can help you determine how often do I really need to look at this particular control or that particular control to see how effective it is. What about the level of rigor for security assessments? So we can use a risk assessment to help us determine how deeply we need to go into our security assessment or assessment of an individual control. And what assessment methods are we going to use? So when we get to 53A, we have examine, interview, and test. So if our risk assessment tells us that there's maybe a moderate to high level of risk here, then maybe we want to up the number of tests we do, or maybe we want to add testing instead of just interviewing or examining. So that helps us with the rigor of our assessment methods. And the number of objects assessed. So all of these things, when you get to doing your assessments in step 4, you make these determinations and you put them in your security assessment plan, and the risk assessment can help you make these determinations. So that's the whole point here. You can use the results from your control assessments to help you identify residual risks or vulnerabilities. So we have a back and forth two-way communication going here. We're using the risk assessment to inform how we do our security assessments, and then when we get that result, we can go back and assess risk, the risk of some of the problems we might have found with some of our control implementations. Does that make sense? Somewhat? Okay. And then also we can use those updated risk assessment results to determine severity of residual risk. So how bad is it, and that can help us decide, do we want to mitigate it or accept it, or how much mitigation do we want to do. So it's pretty important at step 4, at the assessment step. And then we have step 5, which is where the authorizing official decides whether or not to accept the risk of operating the system. And so the authorizing official is going to find that risk assessment information very important to help he or she determine whether or not they want to approve authorization to operate, or maybe even deny authorization to operate because the risks were too great. Or they might decide, let's do some additional mitigation strategies, and then maybe I'll authorize it to operate. So the risk assessment figures prominently there, as do the results from the control assessment in step 4. And in step 6, during our ongoing monitoring, then we want to be looking at that risk assessment to make sure the controls are effective, and what is the risk if they aren't, or if there's a problem at some level. What about changes to the systems or environments of operation? So if we have a change, we're going to need to go through and assess the risk of that change. And in fact, part of configuration management and security-focused configuration management is doing a security impact analysis when we make changes to our systems. So that all figures in, and that's security impact analysis is basically a risk assessment of a change. So that's how we would use the risk assessment at step 6. And also, my least favorite, I don't like to make the focus of our processes beyond compliance, but we have to accept that we do have to comply with policies and laws, so it can help us make determinations if we are compliant with policies. And right, monitoring results as a result of all the data we gather from our continuous monitoring program, that's going to feed into helping us find information on any new vulnerabilities that might be popping up, and we can address those through the risk assessment process. So did that make sense at the system level, and where we might use the risk assessment process throughout the risk management framework? Any questions there? Okay. So the process itself, we have 3 steps. So in 39, 30, and 37, we have similar, and actually 37 and 128. We basically have we have steps and then tasks within each step. So that's sort of the organization that we go with. It seems to work well enough. And so let's see. Yeah. So we have prepare for the assessment. And you'll notice also a pattern. The first step always has to do with planning and preparing. So in risk management, we saw framing, which is basically planning and preparing, coming out with a strategy. Here we are going to prepare for the assessment and make some planning determinations initially before we just dive right in. It's kind of like, let's read the instructions before we start putting this thing together. And then of course we conduct the assessment, and we have some tasks associated with that, and then we maintain or monitor the assessment, and we have some tasks associated with that. So in the prepare step, task, so I am going to go through the task here, and since we are going to be doing a risk assessment in the workshops, it's good if everyone pays attention here, so it'll be more familiar to you on Thursday or Friday at the workshop. But anyway, you identify the purpose. Why are we doing this? Is this an initial assessment that we're doing for the very first time? Are we updating it? Are we trying to establish a baseline of risk? Are we just trying to figure out what are we going to look at over time? What factors are we going to look at over time? And that's the initial purpose. The updated purpose, if you're updating your assessment, then you might be looking again for the ongoing effectiveness, new risks that have popped up based on changes, or any compliance verification activities that you've done. And so those might feed into your risk assessment or cause you to have to do one. And so you're just identifying that in this first task. In the prepare task, second task for the prepare step, we identify the scope of the risk assessment. So what is it going to encompass? Where are our boundaries here? what tiers are we going to be addressing? What organizational parts are going to be effective? Who do we need to communicate with that we're even going to be doing this? Who do we need to talk to about it? What stakeholders do we need to talk with and inform? What decisions will the results support? Is it going to be across the whole organization? Are there going to be technology considerations? We have to make these determinations here when we identify the scope. And how long will these results be relevant? So this is something that you also have to determine. How often are you going to be doing these risk assessments? Maybe you want to set a timeline. Either you can have event-driven assessments, a new assessment based on some event that happens, like somebody mentioned, something happens, oh crap, we didn't expect this, we better do an assessment. Or you can have a time-driven assessment. So maybe you say, we're going to do this at least, we want to make sure we at least do this every year, and maybe more frequently if we have an event-driven problem. So, and what will trigger the need? Again, what events might trigger the need to update a risk assessment if you're not going to do an effectiveness time frame? And these are decisions that you get to make as an organization. We're not telling you and that's something that I guess I should mention. Across all of our pubs, we almost never tell you, you must do it this way in this amount of time, and this, we'll never do that because, for one thing, our guidance has to be applicable to such a broad range of organizations and systems. So what works for one organization or system doesn't work for another one. But also we want people, we don't want a checklist mentality. We want people out there, we want our security professionals thinking about these things and managing their risk and not just checking off boxes that they're told to in NIST publications. So we almost always leave it up to the organization to decide what's going to work best for them in their applications.
So does that mean, say if you're doing an initial assessment, you don't necessarily need to start looking at the tier 1 level? You can start essentially any level you like, whether tier 1, tier 2, tier 3.
Well, so yes and no. Hopefully still there would be an assessment taking place, but maybe before you do the organizational level ones, you want the information from the lower level ones, So, but if you decide you don't need, you're just going to accept the information from the lower levels, that's up to you. But read through 839 and 830. So, anyway, let's see, where are we? Task 2. Okay, so let's move on to task 3 under the prepare step. And here's where we identify assumptions and constraints. So this is pretty important because we need to know what assumptions we're making and what constraints we have before we start delving into it. And so assumption areas, you might make some assumptions about threat sources and threat events, basically about all of your risk factors, vulnerabilities, impacts, and assessment and analytic approaches. So what assumptions did you make there? And we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll definitely talk more about that when we do the risk assessment, because we'll identify some during the workshop. We'll identify some assumptions and some constraints. Some constraints you might have: what resources do you have available? What skills and expertise are available? Maybe you don't have the people with the skills and expertise that you need, and then you have to bring in a contractor or something. So, or maybe you can't do that, and so that would be a big constraint if you didn't have people with the appropriate skill level. So it's important to identify these things and plan for that. And what operational considerations might you have? Physical locations, mission needs. You have to look at all of those sorts of things and how you might be constrained. And your physical location might limit what you can do and what you can assess. So that is task 1.3. And task 1.4 is identifying what sources of information you're going to use. So we're not identifying the source of our threats, but we're identifying where are we going to get the information about our threats. How do we even know what threats we're facing? Where are we going to get that information? And so there are some resources out there that can help you, and you can see them listed there under potential sources. There's in the appendices are a good source of information about threats and vulnerabilities and impacts. And then you have some external sources like US CERT, go to their website, there's a lot of information there. And ISACs are information sharing and analysis centers. Has anybody ever heard of those? So you can go out there, I believe they're sector specific, so you can check depending on what sector you're working under and see what they've got out there. And there's tons of other sources that you can look at. And you might have your internal sources like incident reports, business impact analyses, like we mentioned, logs. So you can look at all of these sources to get the threat, vulnerability, and impact information that you need. So identify where you're going to get that information first before you start. Task 5 is defining the risk model. So we already saw what that looked like. You know, it's really, I can't think of too many reasons why it would really change from that basic model with threats and vulnerabilities and likelihoods and impacts and so on, the use of the risk factors. And for each assessable risk factor, the appendices do include assessment scales with different representations. And again, we'll see that in the workshop. But the risk model that I showed you, I guess we'll just scroll back here really fast. There it is. So this is a pretty standard adversarial risk model, so I can't see too many reasons why anyone would deviate much from that. So I would start with this model, and if you need to tweak it, go ahead and do so. But the point is to identify what that risk model is before you get started on your assessment. So then we jump in. Now we've done our planning and our preparing, and we know the answers to all of those questions, and so now we're going to start conducting the risk assessment. And so that's step 2, and task 2.1 is identify and characterize. So we're going to identify our threats. What is threatening us? And we have some characteristics that might define the types of threats. So their intentions, targeting, and capabilities. And if you're in law enforcement, you might have heard of MOM, the motive, opportunity, and means. It's kind of similar to that. So what is their intention? What is their motive? What are they targeting? And do they have the means? Do they have the capabilities, either resource-wise or, technical prowess to actually be a threat to you. And in Appendix D, we have tables for identifying threat sources that you can use and that we will use in the workshop. So, but in any case, in Task 1, you identify those threat sources and characterize them. And then in the second task under Conduct, then we go into identifying the threat events and how relevant they are and what the threat sources are. Now, we have a many-to-many relationship between threat events and threat sources. So a given threat source could cause, a multiplicity of threat events and really vice versa. So it's kind of difficult to map that out, and it does increase the complexity, but we try to figure it out anyway. And what is the relevance of each identified threat? How relevant is it to our organization? And that has a direct linkage to your organizational risk tolerance. And then what are all potential threat sources are identified for each threat event. So we try to do that threat source to threat event mapping, but again, it can become kind of unwieldy. So when we do the workshop, we're going to keep it simple, but in reality, it can get a little complex. And then we go on in Task 3 to identify our vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions. So, vulnerabilities are it's pretty straightforward. How might you be vulnerable? You know what your threats are, so then you look at, am I vulnerable to this threat? Is our system vulnerable? Is our organization vulnerable? Is our mission business process vulnerable to a given threat that we identified in Task 2? And so, again, we have that, first, let's talk about predisposing conditions. You might have geographical conditions or, that affect you, that predispose you to certain problems or vulnerabilities. Or maybe if you're a university, you have a predisposing condition that you have to leave your network a little bit open because of academia and things, along. So things like that might be a predisposing condition that affect your risk assessment. So we want to identify those. And then again, we do have that many-to-many relationship with vulnerabilities and threat events. And a lot of people ask us at NIST, why can't you map all the controls to threats that they resolve? And that's because it would, like, the catalog is already, you know, this thick. So if the many-to-many mapping is just so unwieldy, you know, from a control perspective anyway. These mappings are, these many-to-many relationships, it really does make it difficult to do any meaningful mappings. But we at least want to try to look at it and determine the relationships between our vulnerabilities and threat events, and identify those predisposing conditions that affect how susceptible you might be to the vulnerabilities that you identify, and then we determine which of those are relevant to which threats, and again, that's that complex mapping. And then we try to identify all our potential threat sources for each relevant threat event. So that can be a pretty daunting task depending on how big your system is or what level you're doing your risk assessment at. Now in task 2.4, we determine our likelihoods of adverse impacts occurring. So how likely is it? Is this, you know, if we say one of our threats is a nuclear bomb, it's going to obliterate our entire city, you know, hopefully that's not too likely. And that's an extreme example, obviously, but that's probably not too likely. And so that might not even be something you want to consider if it's so unlikely that as to be unrealistic, or maybe even as to not matter, because then you know, don't consider those. But we want to determine the likelihood of the impacts occurring, or of the what? Okay. Well, anyway, so we haven't determined the impacts yet, but we want to determine the likelihood. So we look at the characteristics of the threat sources, and this is what we consider when we're trying to decide how likely it is. What are the characteristics of those threat sources? Again, the capabilities, the intentions, and their motivations. And what are they targeting? And we consider the vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions we already identified, and the countermeasures that we might be planning, or the mitigation techniques that we might be planning to implement to help mitigate such impacts. And then we have three moving parts here with likelihood. We look at the likelihood that the threat event will actually be initiated. So that's one part. So we have that, how likely is that? Then we look at the likelihood that initiated events are going to cause an actual adverse impact. So first we have the likelihood, maybe it's going to happen, but if it happens, it's the likelihood, or the resulting in an adverse impact maybe isn't as likely. And so we look at that likelihood. And then we sort of combine those in the third step for the overall likelihood. So again, it seems a little weird now if we're just talking about it if you've never done this before, but hopefully when we go through it in the workshop, it'll become more clear. And so those are the three parts to determining the likelihoods. And then we come to task 5 and determine the adverse impacts. So again, we basically consider similar things that we considered for the vulnerability or for the likelihoods. We can consider those characteristics again. We consider the vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions that we already determined, and what countermeasures do we have planned to implement or implemented to impede the events. And we describe those adverse impacts in terms of potential harm. So how bad is it going to be? What harm is really going to occur to our organization, to our system, to our mission if this happens? And then we give it one of those ratings. We decided if we're just using high, moderate, low, or very low, or if we are doing semi-qualitative or semi-quantitative, where we give it a 78 or whatever. And then, of course, the more critical a system or asset is, the higher the adverse impact is. So, I mean, that seems obvious, but if it's something that's the most critical business system that you have, then, you know, the adverse impact of it not being available or confidentiality being breached is obviously higher, much higher adverse impact than a system that you could live without for 2 weeks or something like that. So we take all that into consideration when we're determining our impacts. And then, related to all 5 of the tasks in step 2, we capture our uncertainty info throughout those tasks. And when we make determinations about our vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions and our threats and our threat sources and our impacts and our likelihoods, what uncertainties did we have? What were we not sure about? And we want to note that down and capture that information, so that later, if something happens, we can go back and say, oh yeah. Or you might want to double back and try to find out more information about it so it's more certain, so you might have that on a to-do list. And so we have uncertainties that may arise from sources such as missing information. So that's what I was kind of just getting at. Maybe you want to double back and try to find that information, but for now you need to move forward, and so you just note down that you're missing that information. You got your subjective determination. So again, somebody, even if you have a large group of subject matter experts and stakeholders, somebody's always got something that they're more hyped up about than somebody's own little pet peeve. So watch out for those subjective determinations, and you can even note it down. You can even say, this person really felt strongly about this, but the rest of the group didn't, and so we moved on, but here's a notation that this was a big concern for someone, and why. And then what assumptions did you make? So keep track of all of that related to uncertainty, and when you're giving this information to hopefully a senior level executive to make decisions with, they need to know that this uncertainty information is there, so they can use that same information to help them determine and make a risk management decision. So, and that kind of brings me to a topic about documentation. So, documentation has been, I mentioned early on about the paperwork exercise, and documentation's become sort of somehow a bad word. And I just want to take the time now to say that documentation is important, and documentation doesn't mean giant reams of paper. Hopefully it's electronic now for one thing, but in, writing things down and noting it down that this has happened and this is historical information that it really can be helpful, and time again it happens that you think about, what did we do then? Why did we make this decision? Were we crazy? And if you had written it down, then there might have been a valid reason that you just can't remember now, and or maybe people have left and they're not here anymore. Why did so-and-so make this decision? Well, I don't know. Maybe that person had a really good valid reason that needs to be used moving forward, but if that information is lost, then you can run into problems later. And so a really fast story that happened to me, and I mentioned I worked at Point Magoo for the Navy at the personnel support detachment there, and the way I got that job was very unfortunate for someone else, and this is an absolutely true story. The person who, and this was a job that was basically system administration, and there was a number of servers, a number of network printers, there was about 50 workstations, there was a router and switches, and numerous applications to deal with. And so in those personnel support detachments, there was one system admin person, and that was it, and no one else had any information technology expertise whatsoever. So anyway, the gentleman unfortunately literally passed away of a heart attack in his car on the way driving to work one morning. And so obviously that was something that he had not planned for, and he had not documented a single thing. And so when I got to that job, I had to figure out what was connected to what was installed on what machines, how were the switches configured, what network printer, all of that. I had absolutely no clue. It took me several months to really go through it. And if he had just left it, even a network diagram, that would have been so helpful. So just something that simple that you don't really think about underlines the importance of documenting things. And so don't let anyone tell you that documentation is bad or a waste of your time, because it's not. So with that being said, we can move on to task 2.6, which is finally, after we've done the first 5 tasks and we note down what our uncertainty is, now we do that determination of risk. What is the impact, what is the likelihood, and we make a determine based on that. And note there at the bottom that if the likelihood is 100%, then risk equals impact. So, And again, that becomes clearer when we go through the exercise and we have our little tables that are from the appendices, and you'll see how that works. But note also that that may not hold true for aggregated risk, so that might be true at your system level, but when you bring that up to the top of the triangle with aggregated risk, it may or may not still be true, so just keep that in mind. And then, we've rolled through things pretty quickly here. So now we maintain the risk assessment, and again, we get to that word monitoring, ongoing monitoring. So keep in mind again that we don't mean a separate monitoring silo for each one of these publications. So it should be wrapped up into one big continuous monitoring program, which we'll talk about again during the 37 discussion. And the whole objective is to maintain ongoing situational awareness of the security state of your organization. So that's really the whole point of monitoring in general. What is my situation with risk and right now? And hopefully you can keep everything updated and as part of your continuous monitoring program so that that information is as current as it possibly can be and not 3 years old, because we're not doing a static process anymore. And results are used to refresh risk assessments at the frequency deemed appropriate by the organization. So again, hopefully that's not every 3 years. Hopefully you have you have the resources to go ahead and keep up with the monitoring of your risk assessments and doing them more frequently. Okay. So maintaining the risk assessments. Task 3.2, update the existing risk assessments using results from monitoring, and sorry, I'm trying to read it, but I can't see what it says. Updating based on organizational determinations of frequencies and relevant circumstances. So these are reasons why you might be doing the updates and should do the updates, and you might need to revisit the prepare step. So if things have changed and you're circling back and you're updating your risk assessment, you may need to change some of the things that we determined in the framing, in the prepare step, some of that planning that we did when we looked at our assumptions and predisposing conditions and those sorts of things that we did during the prepare step. You might need to go back and revisit those. If there have been no significant changes, then your updates are just identifying and assessing how risk factors may have changed. So, and remember what our risk factors are: the threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts. So did any of that change? Then you would make your updates based on that. So yeah, right. So you can see here new threat events or new threat sources, etc. Okay, so here's the appendices that we have, and you can see it kind of goes along and just in the order of the steps and tasks that we just did, where we have, well, in almost every one of our pubs, Appendix A is always references, B is a glossary, and C is acronyms in most of our pubs, not every one, but most of them. And then we get these other appendices, and again, we'll be using these extensively in the workshops, but there's an appendix with threat sources, one with threat events, one with vulnerabilities, one with likelihoods, one with impacts, and then one to help you with your risk determinations. And also risk prioritization, and then in this case, just a summary of the tasks in a table format. Okay, so each appendix, why did I not print these out so that I could see them? So these are the tables that are provided in the Appendix D, and again, we'll be using these. The table 1 is always just input to the threat sources. What inputs did we use to make the determinations for the other tables? So I largely, when we do the workshop, I largely ignore the number 1 tables in every appendix. But anyway, we have our threat sources, we have our scales, we have our characteristics, and so we're noting things, we're making determinations and noting things down and using some of the tables to get information and using some of the other tables to write down our determinations. And those are the template ones there, 7 and 8. And the same thing as we go along, it's similar in every appendix. We tell what our inputs are, then we have some examples, and then we have some templates for you to fill out. And let's see here. If no adversary with the necessary capabilities has been identified, related threat events can be eliminated. Right. So when you get to, you identified your threat sources, and now if you can't identify any related threat events, then just eliminate that. Don't keep that on your list. So. Let's see here. I mean, the point is that's the point of going through each thing and separating the sources from the events, because you might have threat sources all over the place, but they might not have the ability to cause an event, or you might not be vulnerable to the event. And if that's the case, then you want to drop that off your list, at least for now. Let's see. The occurrence of adversarial threat events is dependent on the capabilities of the adversary. So that's kind of what I just said. Appendix F is your vulnerabilities and predisposing conditions, again with the scales and the templates and the taxonomies, and then more scales. So we have it for the vulnerabilities and then for the predisposing conditions. And then our likelihoods of occurrence, again our scales, and let's see templates there, but there is a template. And finally, our impacts, what are they? There's some examples, there's some scales, and then there's a template, and same with the risk scales, and we bring it all together, so when we get to Appendix I, we bring all the risk, the information from the tables that we previously did in D, E, F, and G, and H, and then we use that information and put it into the tables in Appendix I, and then that's where we have it all together, and that's where we can make our final risk determination. And we do separate that out for adversarial and non-adversarial. Risk prioritization. So this is something I mentioned a little bit earlier, that you especially when you're doing your responses, you need to have it prioritized. How you probably, whatever the worst risk is, a lot of times you might need to address that first, and so you have to have a way of prioritizing it. And if there's too many risks clustered around the same, so if you come out with all your determinations and say you've used a semi-quantitative scale, and all the risks come out around in the 60 to 75 range, that's pretty close. So what are you going to do? I guess you could revisit, did you do it right the first, is this really correct? And if it is, then you still need to find a way to prioritize those, because since they'd be so clustered in that same area. And so you would want to be sure that the decision makers had this maybe additional information. How critical would the immediate impact be, and how critical would future impact be? So that's one way to prioritize. Is this something that is going to affect us now, or today, or really soon, or is it something that probably maybe isn't going to happen because of the capabilities, or something like that maybe might not happen till later? And so that might be one thing you can use, one way you can prioritize. And then some further refining of prioritization, you can ask about what is the expected loss. So this could also help you. I mean, we said impact, we talk about impact in the qualitative, high, moderate, or low, or the semi-quantitative scales. But with impact, we might actually be able to tell how much would this really cost us, if we had to replace this whole system, or if this system was down for a week, what would it really cost us? And so that can help us also prioritize. Let's see, if risk could materialize more than once, right? So if it's something that could happen continually, then that might give it a higher priority if it could happen again and again, rather than maybe just a one-time only. So if you might be talking about a virus infection versus a hurricane or something like that. Could the occurrence result in other identified risks materializing? So one vulnerability and threat pair could open you up for more. So if one problem could lead to other problems, then you might want to, and you have to prioritize, then you might want to fix the problem that's at the top of that pyramid before it flows down to cause other problems. So those are just that's some information that you find in Appendix J to help you prioritize, especially if you have the clustered situation with your risks at the end. And that is all. So that was fast.